Hi, everybody. It is so great to be here with you all for this call on Regions Up approaches in Governor Newsom's California Comeback Plan. And we are really excited about having some important folks here to talk with us about the plan, including Michael Tubbs, who is, of course, the former mayor of Stockton and now the special advisor for economic mobility and opportunity for the governor, and Julie Su, who is the secretary of the Labor and Workforce Development Agency. These are folks who care deeply about our state, its regions, the diversity of those regions and communities across the state, and we're thrilled they're here with us. We also have the actual experts on the ground who did all the work to make this happen, who are, you will hear from later from across our agency's OPR and the Strategic Growth Council. So I'm really excited to be here to talk about this issue because regions and Regions Up planning is really, really important to us at the Office of Planning and Research. And what do I mean by the Regions Up approach? Well, the governor made clear in his first State of the State address that he fully recognizes that California is made up of diverse regions with different economies, different geographies, different cultures, different climate impacts, that there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to addressing those issues across every part of the state. He kind of put that together and codified it in his Regions Rise Together agenda, which OPR and GoBiz co-led early in the governor's term, and with which we got to meet a lot of you who were here on the call. COVID-19 has really underscored, the diversity of regions and really their resilience in the face of those economic shocks. This last year has hit California's regions and communities in various and very inequitable ways. And recovery and the transition to a new carbon neutral economy will look different across the state as well. So will the current and projected impacts from climate change. And frankly, our ability to become more resilient to those impacts, to become more sustainable as a state, and to ensure that our economy is inclusive and provides benefits and opportunities for all Californians. The comeback plan, the governor's comeback plan, recognizes all California's regions rise and fall together, but at the same time, the state does have core values that we really believe that are woven through the comeback plan and that will guide development across the state. And those are really the core values of climate action, ensuring that we are not only, again, becoming resilient in the face of these impacts, but also competitive in the face of a transition to a carbon neutral future. Climate impacts, as well as building a high road economic future where there are good quality jobs and pathways, clear pathways into those jobs for everyone. The state's committed to supporting a Regions Up approach where every part transition to a carbon neutral future in ways that make sense given diversity of the state, and committed to providing the systems and support that underpin our recovery in that high road transition, including climate smart infrastructure, workforce investments, and education investments. So that's why we're here to talk about some key elements of the California Comeback Plan that drive resources to regions and communities. These are found across every part of the budget. The ones we're going to focus on today include the Community Economic Resilience Fund, which is found in the labor budget, the Regional Early Action Planning grants for reduction of vehicle miles traveled, which is found in the housing budget, the Regional Adaptation and Resilience Planning grants in the climate budget, the K16 Regional Education grant program in the education budget, and underpinning all of this, capacity building grants for underserved communities to participate in all these processes found in the climate budget. These programs provide a structure and capacity for regions across the state to access and leverage a huge amount of other programs we aren't talking about today. All of the workforce investments, all of the infrastructure investments, and of course, a key focus on innovation and small business that's found throughout the budget. So I'm going to stop and turn over to the next panelist. I will say, I forgot to introduce myself. I'm being told in the chat. I'm Kate Gordon. I'm the director of the Governor's Office of Planning and Research and the chair of the Strategic Growth Council. Thank you again for being here. And I'm going to turn it over to my friend and an inspiration to me, former mayor of Stockton and the governor's education and mobility advisor, Michael Tubbs. Michael, to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and so good to see everyone. I was struggling as to whether it was more fun to be on the receiving end of this amazing opportunity to design a localized solution to localized problems. Or on the end I'm at now, I'm working with amazing public servants like Kate, like Julie, like their whole offices and staffs, and thinking about how do we make sure that state government is a partner, is a friend, and is an ally in doing the hard work of designing equitable communities. And I say this knowing the work is difficult, the work is hard to really change how we think, to really realize that the issues we see in our communities aren't because of the people in the communities, but because of policies, practices, and systems, and then looking ourselves in the mirror and saying we have the agency to do something about it. But I think in this May revise, the governor and the entire team, we really have stuck our flag in the ground and saying that the path forward is a path that understands the most important investment we can make is an investment on our people. And also number two, that state government doesn't have all the answers. We have values. We really believe in equity. We really believe in the California for all, but we also believe in the capacity of our locals to do the work, to help point us as to what's working, what's not, and to really work with their communities to get us to where we want to be post-COVID-19, which is truly a golden state for all. So for all the locals and other folks on the call, realize that these are dollars in the budget. And as a former mayor, I know that resources aren't everything, but resources are a big part of it. But I would also say, now that the resources aren't here, that gives away one excuse, right? Like now that we have the resources, it's incumbent on us to ensure that we use those resources in a way that tangibly benefit the people who aren't on this webinar, that tangibly benefit the people who don't get paid to think about a just transition, who don't get paid to think about regionalism, but have to live with the consequences of government action. So to whom much is given, much is required. We're giving billions of dollars, and we're also giving our partnership in terms of state government and walking with you each and every step of the way, because we understand this is more about a journey than a destination, but we have to begin. So again, I'm just incredibly proud to be part of this administration. I'm incredibly jealous for the amount of resources that local planners and economic development teams and mayors and councils and counties are getting to really design a future, but ensuring that the future looks like what we want it to look like in terms of one where prosperity is broadly shared, one that recognizes the dignity of all people, and one that truly understands that, again, the issue isn't in our residents, the issue isn't in individuals. The issues are more macro and in structures and policies. And we have a way to show that being good stewards of our earth, of a transition to clean energy is a scary one, but one that's actually better off in the long run and leads to good jobs, good communities, and good opportunities. So again, thank you again to Kate and team, and looking forward to seeing the great work you all do. And we're here to help you every step of the way.
Thank you so much, Mayor Tubbs. And I bet everyone on this call would love to have you help them. You don't have to be jealous. I'm sure they all want you working with them, alongside them, figuring out how to equitably access these dollars and navigate the system, which can be a little confusing. So really appreciate your partnership and bringing your local knowledge to the state, so that we're making sure that these dollars are really targeted in the way they need to be. With that, I'm going to turn to my friend, Secretary Julie Su, who is the Secretary of the Labor and Workforce Development Agency, and a true champion of many of the issues we're talking about today. Julie?
Thank you so much, Kate. Thanks to you. Thanks to Mayor Tubbs. We'll always call him Mayor Tubbs. And it's, one of the hardest jobs is to follow the two of you in speaking. So I'm going to do my best here. I'm really grateful to be here. I wanted to really just echo what both Kate and Michael have already said and build on it a little bit. The governor's the May revision, which we call the California Comeback Plan, is really a collaboration, the areas we're going to talk about today, between Kate's office, OPR, our Labor and Workforce Development Agency, the Governor's Office of Business and Economic Development, and the Chancellor's Office in putting together a cohesive vision for how we recover from this pandemic better than we entered, and how we build an economy that is not only characterized by growth and prosperity, right, getting to that, but also equity and resilience and carbon neutrality. And we call that a high road economy. So as Kate already said, we're really coming off of the worst year in recent memory, and many people have experienced deep and traumatic loss. And the global pandemic has changed life as we know it, and it's hit vulnerable communities the hardest, including African Americans, Latinx, Pacific Islanders, women, the elderly, and low-wage workers, especially women of color. And so our California Comeback Plan is really about addressing what everybody says, the pandemic has laid bare, but how do we make addressing it more than just words? To Mayor Tubbs's point, how do we really deliver on making things look different as we move forward? There was collective sacrifice to get California to where we are now, which is one of the lowest places of COVID transmission in the nation. But again, those sacrifices were also not born equally, and businesses closed, in some cases whole industries closed, and workers have paid the price, both on the front lines and on the unemployment lines. Just a couple of things to drive home what we've seen, right? Between the last week in February and just 2 weeks later, unemployment insurance claims in California jumped 1,400%. There were more claims filed by mid-April of 2020 than in all of 2019. And of course, each claim represented someone who suddenly had the ground fall out from under them. And in addition, right, we know that even people who were employed, who did not have to apply for unemployment insurance, were not enjoying the quality of jobs, right? Livable wages, health insurance, job security, union protections, upward mobility, and other aspects of a job that we really want to characterize work in California. And California's economy, like that of the nation's, has really seen a hollowing out of the middle, right? Growth in high wage jobs, growth in low wage jobs, but a lessening share of those kinds of jobs, again, that we would say are quality jobs that include health and retirement benefits and other forms of economic security. And moreover, not all regions of California have fully participated in California's economic success and its vibrant economy. So that idea of focusing on regions, as Kate mentioned, it was part of her vision when this administration began. It was part of the governor's commitment to saying, we want to look at places like Stockton, like the Inland Empire, not just the coastal regions. And now the governor's California Comeback Plan includes nearly $1.1 billion investment in an economic resilience and jobs package to tackle these challenges head on. They tackle, not just the issues of the pandemic, but also the decades-long trends before that of growth in low-wage work and the growing gap between rich and the poor. So the plan does include a $750 million community economic resilience plan. I'm not going to say too much about that because my brilliant and visionary colleague, Sarah White, is going to talk about it. But I just want to say why, as Labor Secretary, it's so important to invest in bottom-up planning that is region by region focused. Recognizing that one size does not fit all, especially here in California, a state of this size and of our diversity. And we have to be intentional about what economic development and growth look like. We have to be intentional about job creation. And in the language of economists, we have to think about the demand side for labor. So that fund has to do with that. The governor's plan also includes roughly $330 million to get workers into good jobs. And this includes building bridges between community colleges and our workforce agencies, transforming our workforce system so that we're truly preparing workers for those quality jobs. So we're truly meeting employer needs, and we're combating the systemic exclusion of those who've been too often left behind, even in good times. And this is about the supply side for labor. And what we want to emphasize is that we understand, we know that you also understand, that we can't do just one of these things. If we're not intentional about job creation, all the training in the world is not going to lift workers out of poverty and make regional economies strong. And we know that if we aren't training with the needs of employers and workers in mind and committing to true access for those who are otherwise left behind, we're going to reinforce all the inequities, and we're going to miss out on the talent and abilities of California's diverse people, going back to Mayor Tubbs's point about that. And so just to say of the work for the training pieces of this have to do with pathways, right? They're doubling down on high road training partnerships and high road construction careers. I know many of the folks who are here today have helped to make those a reality. We are making bigger and deeper investments in those, building on current ones, and also expanding them into new industries, looking at hospitality, transportation, healthcare, and more. And we're also putting funds into the employment training panel to make sure that employers who invest in their workers, who do right by working people, are those who get the support of government funding, and expanding those to include information technology, advanced manufacturing, the public sector, training tens of thousands of workers for good jobs. And so just one last thing I'll say about this is that while so much about the last year was not foreseen, many of these investments are made possible because of work that was done beforehand. And I think that's an important point about this budget, about why these kinds of investments are possible now, and also why they make sense. You know, some are going to say, this is a lot of money, it's too big. How do we measure whether they succeed? Of course we have to do those things. Of course we have to deliver. Of course we have to measure. But we also can't just rely on the same things that have been done. We have to go bigger. And so we know that regional planning works. We know that HRTP works. We know from the work of the Governor's Future of Work Commission, which many of you also participated in, that we need to end poverty jobs. We can't just say any job is a good job. You know, bad jobs are a policy choice just as much as good jobs are policy choice. And we have to make better choices about that. And this budget does reflect that across all of our areas. There's these investments, but they're also connected to other things we want to do, right? If we want to create more affordable housing, it's not just about combating homelessness and the lack of affordability. It's about creating good jobs in the communities that need them the most. Same for improving our climate, same for clean water, same for care. And how do we focus on working people and building an economy on good jobs? This plan is all about that.
Thank you so much, Secretary. So inspiring as always. And I think between you and Mayor Tubbs really underscoring, you know, yes, this is a big agenda, but it's a big agenda. This is an agenda that's about making sure that we have a resilient and climate smart future that creates jobs that are good jobs and pathways into those jobs. It's a climate agenda, it's a worker agenda, it's an equity agenda. It's a community-driven agenda. So that is not a small thing, and this is not a small budget to address it. So thank you so much, Secretary. And with that, I'm going to turn to the first of our speakers talking about a little more detail on one of the pieces of this plan. And you already heard a preview of it from the Secretary, and that is Sarah White, who is OPR's Senior Advisor for Jobs and the Economy, to give us a little more background on the Community Economic Resilience Fund. Sarah?
Great, thank you, Kate, and thank you, Secretary Sue. I am going to talk a little bit about the Community Economic Resilience Fund, which is essentially the mechanism for the high road transition and recovery that Kate and Julie so eloquently laid out for us, and touches on the work that Mayor Tubbs described as well. So let me say that this is thinking big. This is a once in a generation investment, $750 million in a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy. The structure of the fund looks like building collaboratives in every region of the state. That is the first step. Building on a lot of the work and planning that's already been done in many of the regions. And then the bulk of the fund is for investments in that transition, in the kinds of economic development that will be required to put the state on the high road and create the kinds of jobs that, that Julie was describing. So let's say a little bit about the structure. As we have heard, the whole fund is premised on the idea that the state cannot and should not tell regions what their economic destiny looks like, right? So the idea is that we are going to fund intermediaries to plan that, but we do, as the state, our role is to provide resources for the regions to make those decisions and build those local economies, but we do have a say in a couple of things. We are going to have a say in who's at the table. We're ensuring a place, for example, for labor so that workers have a say. We're ensuring a place for community voices, in particular, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, the kinds of voices that have too often been left out of decision-making, as well as critical partners, those being business, government, philanthropy, education, the workforce system, and the social service system, and others as well. But we're going to fund intermediaries to pull those partners together to make the high road transition plan in every region. We are also going to have something to say about the kinds of metrics and goals for each of the projects, whatever they may be in each region, and more on that in a moment. But the fund is going to have metrics for, first of all, this is the high road, right? For sustainability. Is there alignment with the state's climate and environmental targets? As well as this is a competitiveness issue, right? When we think about the way that carbon neutrality is driving the international economy, this is going to be critically important to the future of regions' competitiveness and economic success. So we're going to have standards around sustainability. We are going to have some standards around job quality, which Julie described, and which I will just reiterate here, that we believe that you cannot deliver equity without job quality. So job quality is essential. So we're going to invest in regions to decide what their future looks like to create jobs, but we're also going to say that you have to create quality jobs. We're also going to have some metrics around equity, and this is an essential idea of inclusivity in lifting up all Californians in the recovery and in the transition. Now, this looks very different in every region, but in every case, it is designed to lift up families, workers, communities, businesses, and really critically here, a tax base that supports the quality of life that Californians deserve and expect. And this is critical, important to regional investment, right? And finally, I'll say on distribution, that we want to guarantee investment in regions in the hardest hit areas, the areas hardest hit by the pandemic, by climate change, by other economic shocks, and in those inland regions that have too often been left out of Californians' storied prosperity. So we are thinking about high and wide about equity, distribution, sustainability, and job quality. Let me say quickly a little bit about the elements of this transition. So we know that we have to have economic diversification in order to support workers and families in every region. This looks like job creation. This looks like building a tax base. We need to think about industrial planning. And this is some of the work of the investments. We can't say what the investments will look like. I would like to give you examples, but what's going to happen in the Sierras, who are dealing with climate and wildfire impacts in their forests? That's going to be about forest management. It's going to be about feedstock aggregation. It's going to be about wood products. There's any number of things that has to happen in a forested community. That's very different than what the needs and interests might be in the valley, where agriculture is dealing with groundwater management issues and drought. What is that industry going to transform into? What does that look like? And that's also different than a community who is trying to manage changes in the oil and gas industry. And that frankly looks very different in Kern County than it looks like in LA, both areas where that is an important industry, but very different economies. So we're thinking about regions can decide what their projects and investments look like in those transitions in each region. We'll also have to think about safety nets. And you heard there's some interesting work in the budget around basic income and other investments. We also have to think about workforce. And the good news is that, as Julie Sue described, we have a system in place for high road workforce development. It is the high road training partnerships, which will link to any of the industries that are invested in through this economic resilience fund. We have a workforce solution. And all of this will be done via these regional partnerships. So I want to say finally that all of this work requires connections, partnerships, investments across the budget, and we're going to hear about some of those now. So it's going to link to the infrastructure investments across the budget. This might look like oil well capping and remediation. It might look like offshore wind. It looks like ZEV investments. It looks like climate resilience investments. These are all critical pieces of economic resilience and recovery. The workforce investments, the higher ed training partnership investments, the community college investments, critical to this work. The community capacity building that we're going to hear about in a moment. When we imagine this fund, could not imagine doing this without building up the capacity of communities to bring their voice to the table. Not just saying we're setting a seat for you, but that you have the capacity and the leadership and the skill and the staffing and the funding to actually participate in those decisions. So these are all essential companion pieces to the Community Economic Resilience Fund. They are critical elements of the high road transition, and we can't do it without them. So we are delighted. I'm delighted to share the screen with my colleagues who are going to talk about those elements, and also finally say that we are building on the excellent work that all of you are already doing in the regions to advance many of these goals. And this is a way to systematize it and invest in it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was a great overview of the fund, but also of all the connections that we're making across the budget. And we'll hear next from on one of those pieces from Egon Turplin, who is at the Strategic Growth Council and OPR as a Senior Advisor for Economic Development and Transportation. Egon, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate. And thank you, Sarah. And thank you all for being here. To build on this conversation about regional investment, a key piece of the regional infrastructure that many of you on this call are a part of are our metropolitan planning organizations. And you have for many years, but particularly the last 10 years, been putting together joint land use and transportation plans to meet these critical climate commitments and housing targets for our state. And we've heard from many of you for a long time the need for investment to help realize those important and critical goals. So the regional early action planning grants of 2021, it's the $500 million investment that's in the budget, is very much to do that. It's to help you meet your sustainable community strategies, funding to regions with the ability to subgrant to local governments and other stakeholders. This existed 2 years ago in the 2019 budget as a $125 million fund, particularly to meet the higher housing targets. This year, it's broadening to really be about how do we meet the overall climate commitments, in particular, how do we reduce vehicle miles traveled? Or in other words, how do we really fundamentally implement these sustainable community strategies in a ways that accelerates infill development, that makes some of the transportation investments that give people options so they don't have to drive other places, really makes real that particular investment. So that is what the fund is set up to do. It's going through the housing budget into the Department of Housing and Community Development, but HCD is going to be working in collaboration with the Strategic Growth Council and OPR, as well as the California Air Resources Board. And of course, through the Strategic Growth Council, there's all the member agencies that are a part of that. So we're really trying to bring the expertise of the state to work in partnership and collaboration in the regions. One of the things we heard about this REAP program, those of you in this space are aware of it, those of you not, that acronym may be unfamiliar, is the flexibility that you had to implement the dollars. That is what's critical. That's part of what connects this idea to all these other ones. It's about flexibility and regions up approaches that recognizes the diversity of the places. We have commitments at the state towards housing production, towards climate commitments, towards high road, towards all of these important goals, but we need the regions, we need you all to design those investments in a way that works best for your particular community. And so that is what we have structured in here. The way we've proposed it is it will be funding to all regions of California. We want to use the same infrastructure that we had under REAP. So there's an existing grouping in the San Joaquin Valley and the Central Coast, as well as some of the larger regions of the state, as well as other communities that don't happen to have a metropolitan planning organization. They also can participate in the funding. But really thinking broadly about kind of 4 categories of activity. How do we accelerate infill development? And remember, what's important about this that's different from the funding from 2 years ago, this is for planning and infrastructure. So it's flexible to a region. And so we heard a lot from the Sacramento region, the importance of putting money into water and sewer upgrades to make infill possible. So how do you accelerate infill? How do you realize multimodal community? That could be a Vision Zero project or investment in a bike lane. How do we shift travel behavior, which in one region might be implementing a pricing program or setting up a VMT mitigation bank? How do we increase transit ridership? That's a critical need coming out of the pandemic. So those are categories of activity, and we want to put the dollars in your hands to help shape it while working with the state to really design programs and bring help. We can work with the regions to identify what are going to be transformative projects, what are truly innovative projects that are going to move the needle on meeting these climate commitments. So that's the idea. It's $500 million. It's going to be distributed out to the regions, and we're extremely excited to work with you. This is about the partnership that was embedded in the vision of Senate Bill 375 from over a decade ago. This is a piece of our investment to work with you to really realize those goals. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Egon, and just a really important piece of the puzzle of how we think about the land use and on-the-ground planning challenges of building out that more sustainable economy, but also one where people have real access to services and jobs, where there's folks are not having to drive 90 minutes to get to work, where we start to address some of the health, quality of life, and affordability impacts of that development pattern, and start thinking about really how to do sustainable growth that works differently in different places and looks different in different places. So thanks so much, Egon. That was a great overview of that program. All the things that Sarah and Egon have talked about are, of course, happening in the face of a changing climate, and need to be done in as resilient a way as possible, because that climate change, those impacts are happening today, and they will continue happening over this next several decades. And I'm so pleased that Nuantara Key, who is our Deputy Director for Climate Resilience at OPR, is here to talk about some regions up pieces of the budget that address those issues. Nuantara?
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kate, and a very big thank you to all my amazing and inspirational colleagues and all of the speakers here today. It's just so amazing to be a part of this tremendous effort and package that was pulled together as part of the Governor's Comeback Plan. So it's truly an honor to be here. As Kate mentioned, and as we all know, California is already experiencing the impacts of a changing climate. And over the last decade, we have seen just significant impacts across every community in the state, from drought, extreme drought, to flooding, to just record-breaking catastrophic wildfires that have touched every corner of the state in one way or another, and extreme temperatures that continue to rise in communities that are dealing with extreme heat. So we have plenty of challenges, plenty of climate impacts to deal with, and we know that every region experiences these impacts differently, which is why, as part of this package, it is really critical that investing in adaptation and resilience planning be a key piece to the overall Regions Up approach. The proposed $25 million in grants through ICARP, which is the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program, another acronym out there. It's our adaptation program that we run out of OPR, will really provide communities with the planning resources that they need to identify community resilience priorities, really thinking in the long term about the goals and actions to drive resilience and adapt to the changing impacts, climate impacts on the ground. Also, the funding will help local jurisdictions meet state planning requirements, especially around incorporating climate into long-range planning. And lastly, it will support development of a pipeline of competitive climate resilience priorities and projects and implementations on the ground, really tailored to the unique conditions and context of every region in the state. We also recognize and really want to make sure, echoing much of what my colleagues here have mentioned, the need for flexibility. Much of the adaptation planning grants that have been out there, while incredibly valuable, have really spurred a lot of action on the ground. They've also been focused on very specific sectors or just focused on a specific climate impact. But we know communities are dealing with many impacts at the same time, flooding and wildfire at the same time, sea level rise, flooding at the same time, extreme heat. So we really want to be able to provide a flexible pot of funding that allows communities to address the needs that are most urgent for them in ways that are tailored to their region and to their local context. So really looking to build this as a flexible pot of funding to really meet community need. And one quick thing before I hand it back to Kate that I want to mention is complementary to these planning grants is additional investment to ICARP and to our adaptation program that would allow, both through the climate assessment, implementation of climate assessment, as well as additional development of tools and resources that communities need to be able to support these planning activities. And one proposal that's out there that is near and dear to my heart is investment in the development of a vulnerable communities platform. We know that not every community, even within a city or within a region, experience these impacts in the same way. And we really need to be able to equip both our state and local and regional partners with the information to understand how to drive investments to communities that are the most vulnerable, really targeting the needs of communities. So we are looking to be able to build out our capacity to serve communities with these important decision support tools, actionable information that really underpins all of these actions across the climate budget. So with we see these investments as really a down payment on the state's overall resilience strategy. And with that, Kate, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks so much, Nuantara. And I really think it's just underscoring what you said. Even if we were to see a complete kind of reduction of our carbon emissions tomorrow. Many of these impacts that Tara talked about are baked in for the next several decades because of the long life of carbon emissions in the atmosphere. These are real impacts that are happening today. They're going to keep happening, and becoming more resilient in the face of them is critically important. Also, as Sarah said, impacts like drought and snowpack reductions and extreme heat have clear economic implications, including in, for instance, Groundwater Management Act impacts in the Central Valley on agriculture, but also, of course, coastal real estate, coastal construction, many of our transportation investments. And so these really are tied together as important parts of an overall strategy that does look different in different regions, as you keep hearing us say. None of what we've just talked about works if we don't ensure that everyone has a seat at the table, that there is capacity to participate in regional planning in communities and from the ground up. And I'm really pleased to have Executive Director of SGC, Jesse Buendia, here to talk about that piece of this critical budget. Jesse? I hope Jesse's still here.
Yes. Hi, everyone.
Awesome.
Well, first, I just want to say thank you so much to Kate, Michael, and Julie for seamlessly threading these three incredibly important pieces related to the economy, equity, and climate together. And I think it provided a wonderful framework for us to be able to talk about the Regional Climate Communities Program, which we're very passionate about. So the approach for the Regional Climate Collaborative, that's laid out in statute is really focused on building the capacity needed for under-resourced communities across the state to meaningfully participate in the planning and implementation strategies included across multiple areas of this budget, particularly the areas that were spoken about today. And so for us, this investment is foundational. It is the foundation that all the other activities will actually build off of because it supports the participation of stakeholders who have been historically left out of these processes in the past. Under-resourced communities will be at the table to inform these processes, both at the regional level and also at the local level, in order to ensure that they're driving investments into the communities, and that communities who've been demanding these investments on the ground are actually going to be seeing their visions fulfilled. Particularly important is being able to bring and leverage investments such as the transformative Climate Communities Program, which have large integrated multi-benefit programs. We are really building on the success of the Transformative Climate Communities that has a robust collaborative stakeholder structure that includes community-based organizations, local governments, businesses, and other partners who will work together to engage stakeholders, build partnerships, make plans, and coordinate efforts across the state and other funding sources to advance equity and resilience. In turn, it's this social infrastructure and capacity that is being built through the catalyzing these investments that we are really excited to lift up, similar to the example that we have had around Fresno Drive and how that grew out of the Transformative Climate Communities Program. We're really excited to have such champions like former Mayor Tubbs, who's really somebody who's embodying both the local connections that came out of being a recipient of the Transformative Climate Communities Plan, but understanding that really important critical piece of connecting it to that regional tissue that's actually going to be driving these major changes in the state moving forward. And so what you'll see in the Comeback Plan is $20 million over 2 years for the Regional Climate Collaboratives Program, as well as $420 million for 3 years for the Transformative Climate Communities Program. Thank you.
Thanks, Jesse. That was great, and just really, really important set of points about the foundational nature of these projects. I think you can see from the conversation we're having, one of the roles the Office of Planning and Research and the Strategic Growth Council play for the state is connecting across different issue areas with a long-term focus. And every one of the things we've talked about really does connect across agencies, across programs, and engages across the entire state to really ensure as much alignment as possible as we work together at the state level to provide region up support and to provide that interconnective tissue that supports all regions in doing this work. The last piece that I'll quickly touch on is another regional piece in the budget, which is really focused on education, and that's the K-16 Regional Education Grant Program, which would allocate $250 million one-time general fund set aside from the California Comeback Plan for grants to establish K-16 regional collaboratives. This builds on a successful existing K-16 collaborative program that has already been in place since last year, and really focuses on streamlining the educational pathways leading to those jobs we've been talking about in growth industries and sustainable industries in high road industries. So that education piece of the puzzle is the other critical piece of the puzzle, also a regional approach, also in the comeback plan and part of this conversation today. So with that, I am going to start turning to audience questions. And I am really thrilled that folks are already jumping in with questions in the Q&A. Please, just a reminder, it's in the chat as well, that if you have a question you want to upvote in the Q&A, you can do that. Also, you can jump in and add a question if you don't see it there. So I'm going to start. I'm just going to read these, I think, just to avoid complicated technical difficulties. Oh, and before I do that, actually, I just got word that Lande Ajose is here, who is a senior advisor to the governor on higher education and the brains behind the K-16 initiative. So Lande, I don't know if you have a minute and want to just say a few more words about that initiative.
Sure, happy to. Apologies that I couldn't join earlier. I'm toggling between meetings, but we're really excited about the K-12 initiative. It's modeled off of an initiative that currently exists in Fresno, our K-16 actually initiative. And really what that is to do is to really provide a linkage between how we think about schooling and education and jobs, but really utilizing the local and regional context. So what we're putting together are collaboratives that must include a CSU, a UC, a community college district, as well as a K-12 district, and asking those entities to work together and collaborate with their local employers to really think about what are the pathways, what are the occupations for a particular region that are growing, and how do we then start to architect and realign systems all across the educational spectrum to lead to those kinds of jobs, using opportunities during the summer, using external funding, so that students are prepared to embrace those kinds of opportunities, but also that our institutions are being transformed in the process. And so one of the things that we're doing with this particular collaborative is having the institutions adopt several of the recommendations that came out of a report that a task force developed called the Recovery with Equity Report, which looks at 11 institutional and segment practices that need to be in place in order to ensure that our institutions are recovering from the pandemic and the economic recession and the racial reckoning, with a much greater focus on equity, and in a way that's going to actually help to promote student access, student retention, and student completion, as well as the transition into employment with good jobs and good wages. So we're really trying to knit together a very regional approach and a bottoms-up approach with a set of principles and guidelines around best practices, but that is done at the local level and that pivots on local collaboration. So.
Thank you so much, Lande, and really appreciate you making time to be here and talking more about that program. And also, can I just have the panelists in general get on screen so we can do Q&A and folks can see you and see the amazing set of people who have been working for years at the stakeholder and community level to come up with some of the things that ended up in this budget that really were generated from the ground up, and with the facilitation and engagement of all these folks you see here on screen. So I'm going to start with the Q&A, and I am going to, Alyssa, if you can make sure we're on gallery view so everyone can see all the folks, that would be great. Or if you are managing your own Zoom out there, just switch yourself to gallery view. I'm going to look at these upvoted questions, which are really, really good, and I'm trying to figure out how to start. Maybe just with one of the foundational questions from Veronica Garibay, which is, what's the best way for the public to engage with the administration as these proposals are fleshed out through the budget process? And that is a great question, Veronica. I mean, I will say number one is it ain't going to happen unless the budget passes. So the number one thing, frankly, is for you to help us in working with the legislature, which we are all doing kind of day in and day out at this point to make sure that the California Comeback Plan is a reality and that these dollars are available and that they are flowing to communities. So support for the budget for the Comeback Plan is critically important. After that, it's a great question. And Sarah, one thing I'd love you to talk about, you've thought a lot about the planning grants in the Resilience Fund actually creating kind of allowing for people who would help do that connection point with the administration. Can you talk about that for a second?
Sure. Thanks, Kate. I think that's the point is well made that this is all a proposal right now. We don't have a mechanism for the money to flow out to communities yet. We have to get that appropriated in the budget. So, and I think that, calls and letters to let us know your thoughts and let your partners know your thoughts are always welcome. I think that, Kate, I think you're talking about the regional collaborative folks.
Yes.
Sorry. So one of the things that we have heard from past experiences, especially with industry transitions in regions, is that there is so much happening. There are federal investments happening. There are regional and local investments happening. There are state investments happening. This stuff is all intersecting. So one of the things in the Resilience Fund is funding for at least one person, ideally more by county, but at least one person per region to be located in the region to simply be the traffic cop to link all of these efforts to say, here's where the money's coming, here's the different conversations, here's the different tables. There needs to be at least one person, probably more, to actually manage those intersections and keep everyone aware of what's happening back and forth. So that's a key infrastructure piece that we wanted to put in place immediately to help with that.
Thanks, Sarah. And it is a good question. I mean, one of the things that each of these programs does is sort of try to establish some kind of a place to do that connection. And in some cases, it exists already through existing structures like ICARP and the MPOs. And in some places, it's going to be part of the budget proposal. And you'll see that trailer bill language, for those who are familiar with the process, is up for most of these proposals at this point. So really trying to work through that. I have a couple, there's so many good questions here. Julie, I'm going to start with you on this one, although it's kind of a question to everybody, which is, a question about timing. And I think we all recognize these are one-time funds. And Jenna Hornstock asked, these funding programs are exciting. We appreciate flexibility. Will there be more flexibility with time frame for spending? This is a lot of money to spend in a short period of time. We fully recognize that. I just thought, Julie, maybe you could address that and how we sort of deal with, this kind of structural support in the reality of a one-time budget situation. Can you just talk about that from your perspective?
Sure, I'm happy to. I mean, Jenna, it is a very, very good question. I think, the reality of this budget process is exactly what Kate said, right? We have to get the budget passed first, and there's many components to what we've talked about here that are still going to be fleshed out. We've given a lot of thought to them. I think this relates to some of the other questions too, including Claire's question, like how much in each region, right? And who's the intermediate, who needs to be at the table. We recognize the same way we've talked about that regions are different and that one size fits all doesn't work. And regions are going to be at different points in their own planning also, right? There's different resources. There's been a different level of attention to this sort of, economic development work. And so I think what we're going to try to do, it's going to be a balance, right, between putting in place clear guidelines and accountability. Again, that is very important, and we've been pushed on that this last week, even in our hearings with the legislature, who needs to approve the budget. So accountability is going to be important. There's going to need to be some need for structure, and as Sarah said so eloquently, that's an opportunity for us too, right? That the structure will allow us to require things like true inclusion. But we also recognize that there's going to be the need for some flexibility. So I know that's a very general answer to the question, but we're aware of that, and our goal is going to be to create the right balance in that. Now, there's also, as Kate said, a structure for how the funds get paid out. Like there's a whole administrative structure to that also may affect how much flexibility there can be. And we will be, we're just here to be really transparent about those things and know that we have to tackle a lot of those challenges. Our job, we are not intent on making things harder for you all than it needs to be. I know sometimes it will look like that, but there's a lot of pieces that need to go in place, especially when we're talking about, this level of investment. And we're going to be very, very thoughtful about each of those things, knowing that there has to be flexibility, knowing that regions are at different places, but again, being clear about the need for accountability with these public dollars.
Perfect. Thank you, Julie. And I'm glad you also addressed part of Claire's question, which was really about how much does each region receive? Who are the intermediaries? Let me say really quickly that for the Community Economic Resilience Fund, the way it's structured, and I recommend, and we'll put up these links, by the way, in the chat before the end of the call, looking at the budget change proposal or BCP for each of these, as well as the trailer bill language, which is all on the Department of Finance website. What we're envisioning for the Community Economic Resilience Fund is that every single region of the state will receive planning grant funding at the same amount. So we're not doing the population based, we're not doing the big cities get it and everybody else gets what remains. We're doing across the board because every region of the state is dealing with recovery and transition. And then the vast majority of the funds, the remainder will be in competitive implementation grants. The intermediaries are not ours to decide. The intermediary for each region is for the regions to decide, because we should not be in a position of doing that. So that is going to be a bottom-up decision as well, but really a focus on making sure that everyone's got the ability to plan and is put in the best position possible to access competitive implementation funds. I've got a question, Lande. I'm going to go to you because you've worked a lot on this. We talked a lot earlier in the call about how the state is trying with this Regions Up agenda, both to support regions planning at the regional level, but also to provide that interconnective tissue that supports all regional work across the board. And Judy Salmecha asked a great question: is expanded broadband a regional goal? And I would say a resounding yes, but I would love you to talk about that since you've worked so hard on that issue.
Yeah, certainly expanded broadband is a huge regional goal. I'm sure you all saw it in the budget last week that Governor Newsom has proposed a $7 billion investment, billion with a B, $7 billion investment in expanding broadband across the state, that it is unconscionable and that we have regions in the state that don't have access to broadband, and that we are going to work really hard to address that. I think that the demands that we've seen, not only with distance learning, but in things like telehealth, really compel us to make sure that every corner of the state has broadband. Now, having said that, there will be challenges along the way. The challenges that we see with broadband really depend on where in the state you are, and who the providers are, and what it means to shape competition in some of these areas. Who has the last mile. There's going to be a lot of technical work that needs to be done, but we do see broadband as an essential part of that, and it's an essential part now. I think of how we think about education going forward. That is not to say that we're all going to be online forever, but I do think that we know that California is a state that periodically is prone to crisis, particularly various climate crises. And we now know that we have a mechanism whereby we might be able to pivot so that we don't have to lose critical days or hours and learning time for students. So we want to make sure that that is a robust infrastructure. The broadband proposal is about access, it's about equity, it's about jobs, it's about climate, it's about so many different things. And so that is an area that we are hopeful that other Californians will agree. As my colleague said, this is a place where we have done our part on the government side, on the administration side, to tee up a set of proposals with the governor and on behalf of the governor. And now it's our colleagues in the legislature who are really, weighing those proposals. And we're hopeful that they will hear from Californians across the state about the importance of these various elements to the public.
Thanks so much, Lande. There are such good questions coming in, and I'm loving how many of them there are. I just asked the panelists too, if there are sort of more technical questions you're seeing in the area that you're an expert in, please feel free to answer those. Type the answer to those, because we're not going to get to everything, and I want to be as responsive as possible. Multiple questions that are not upvoted, but I just see a lot of them, which are about how are we going to define the regions. This is our favorite topic of conversation at OPR and SGC. But I think, we can talk about it. Everybody can answer it, but I'll just say one of the goals that we have, and you'll actually see this language reflected in a couple places, is not to start a whole new definitional conversation with a whole new structure. there are actually already multiple regional definitions in the state that are used for multiple different programs. And what we want to make sure happens is that the definition of region used is the most relevant to the money going out. So that is not yet fully defined in the Community Economic Resilience Fund. To be honest, the way that we structured it is very similar to the way that Assemblymember Salas structured his AB 106, which had a very similar approach, which was to say that the agency is doing, the administration will figure out the regions based on the key goals of the program, which are this recovery and transition approach. And so that will be likely in alignment with some of the economic regions that we have already in use in the state. But I promise you today, we will not be creating a whole new system of regional definitions. That may, however, look slightly different to, for instance, the program, the REAP program, which is structured through the MPOs, because that is those are the entities that are responsible for responding to the sustainable community strategy and the need to reduce VMT. Egon, you want to add to this?
Yeah, just really quickly, I think absolutely. So we're going to use the existing MPO structure. I think, Terry, you had a question as well. I think we've heard that the multi-county partnerships that REAP set up in the San Joaquin Valley and the Central Coast have been effective. We hear your point about what's different is each region does have its own sustainable community strategy, but we want to really encourage that type of collaboration and sharing across those geographies. So I think the proposal is to maintain that. And then for the 19 counties, Alpine to Trinity, I'm not going to name all of those in between, would have the opportunity to apply directly to HCD. John, to your question as well, a little bit there, that there'll be a set of eligible entities. So it's trying to look at the MPOs that exist, the multi-county ones, and then the other counties. I'm not treating them as a single region, but having the opportunity to apply directly.
I'm going to go to Nuantara on this one, and actually Kieran and or Jesse. Kieran Kumar, who's on screen now, is actually running the 1072, the capacity building piece of this agenda. So I want to have him have a chance to weigh in as well. Important question, which is how do we tie it all together? How do these people all work together at the regional level to make sure that they're kind of working together to deal with climate impacts and recovery impacts and transition impacts and doing it all to create pathways into high quality jobs? How do we do all that at the same, together at the regional level? What are the connection points there? And I'm starting with Nuantara and then go over to Kieran.
Wonderful. Yes, that is a big question. And, I think one of the places that we want to start with that is recognizing that there's existing kind of governance and infrastructure across both the state, but across regions and within communities. So as was mentioned, and, Kate and Egon, we're not trying to recreate some new structure that is going to somehow be, the channel to receive all of this funding and do this work, but actually build on existing structures. So one of those at the state level that is really important that we're going to be working very closely across with all our state partners on is through our Adaptation and Resilience program, or ICARP, which really serves as the hub for interagency coordination and alignment on adaptation and resilience policy and planning work. And so really leveraging that structure as both across with our state agency partners and the coordination and collaboration we do every day, but also recognizing the important role that it is required to coordinate across regions as well. So we will be leveraging our council, our Adaptation and Resilience Council, to help be one of the places where, as the only public body that is state body that's actually specifically charged with addressing adaptation and resilience, as a venue to bring some of these pieces together and these conversations together, including, and there's a question here, I'll respond to it in the chat with more detail, but the guideline processes for how all this funding will be spent out, so that we make sure we're getting public input into these into the guidelines themselves for how the funding is spent. So that's one example. Kate, happy to add on if there's anything else.
No, I think that's great. And I know we're running short of time, but I really wanted Kieran is doing some of the work that is actually going to do this connecting. So Kieran, I wanted to turn to you for a little more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. And Kate, and thanks, Nuantara. Tough question. But I think what we're really excited to underscore is that the Regional Climate Collaboratives program, as envisioned by 1072, really is foundational capacity building for under-resourced communities that is, in one sense, actually place-based in nature, focused on specific initiatives in under-resourced communities, but with the focus on that capacity building work to engage different partners, often non-traditional partners in these larger planning spaces in much broader regional discussions and regional conversations. And so we're really seeing the Regional Climate Collaboratives program as a capacity building program that is, yes, ultimately supporting communities and drawing resources down to address place-based initiatives within their regions, but then also supporting those individuals, entities, community-based organizations, and partners to feed up into these broader processes that we're talking about today. It's a key piece of the equity component in this work, making sure that historically left out voices have a seat at these tables.
Perfect, and we really do see that as that piece as a connection point across all of these areas. You know, honestly, as well as just again returning to those core values that underpin everything we've talked about. The state is in a recovery and a transition to a more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive economy. These pieces all support regions figuring out how to make that work, given their diversity, given their different economies, given the different assets they have to build on, the different climates they're dealing with, and the different communities they have. So we are really committed to this vision. We recognize, and the last thing I'll say, someone asked, is there a place we can look at all this together and sort of see how it all maps out? We are actually developing a fact sheet right now that tries to capture everything we just said, and we'll make sure everyone on this call has that in the next couple of days or the next, I'll say, week or so. But we recognize, and we deal with this too, these things are in all these different budgets, in all these different agencies. They're across the state. We're hearing them in different committees. Everyone on this call has been in like 5 or 6 different subcommittees this week talking about these issues because they are cross-cutting. The structures we have at the state don't really allow for cross-cutting historically, and it's very, very hard to do, but we know that you on the ground, everything you do is cross-cutting. You live in an intersectional world. We are working to make that possible from the state level, to make these to make these intersections clear and to support you in the work that you're doing out there every day. So we really appreciate every one of you. Really appreciate you being on this call. Alyssa's going to put up a slide with how to get more information on all these pieces of the budget, and we are here to support you with questions and in thinking this through with us as we get it to the finish line and see the California Comeback Plan come to reality. So I want to thank everyone who has been on this call. Alyssa, you want to put that slide up of the next steps, and more information on the budget, the California Comeback Plan. Questions you can send directly to us at this email address. Just thank you so much to everyone who's been able to be on the call, to Michael Tubbs, who had to jump actually to go to an event, I think with or for the governor, to Secretary Sue, to Lande, to Sarah, to Nuantara, to Aegon, to Kieran, to Jesse, everybody who was there, and Sandra, of course, and Alyssa for doing all of the work behind the scenes to organize the call. Thank you all. It takes a village. It takes all of us. It takes all of you. Can't wait to keep working together, and see you soon.